So I'm starting recording now. So just let me share my screen. So I've called this training Sound the Alarm, Hope-Based Communication and Emergency Messaging. And as well as it, being a kind of a cool name, there's a little bit of a reason behind the reason the name Sound the Alarm. And that's a story that I'm going to share in just a second. So starting off with this quote, which I think kind of captures what we're going to be talking about today, which is that fear is generally an ineffective tool for motivating genuine personal engagement. And I think this is something we all know instinctively. Like, when I know for me, when I'm in a fear response state, when something says something that scares me, I'm not exactly in an open mind. I'm not ready to think about new ideas. It's kind of that fight or flight thing, right? But as well as it being something that I think we know instinctively, I feel like the question that often comes up is, well, this situation is scary. This situation is urgent. So if we're not using fear, what are we using? How do we communicate the urgency of the situation without just scaring people? I think it's a really big conversation. It's a big topic. And hopefully we'll start that conversation in this session here today, which I think, will go out and we can keep talking about as we move forward as a movement, as groups, and in general. So what we'll cover today, we'll start off thinking about the messaging ecosystem, which is different ideas around communications and messaging. We'll look a bit into hope-based communication. I'm going to cover a little bit about recent research findings on the topic of messaging and communication in social change. And then I'll finish off with what might it mean for us as Animal Rebellion. So there's quite a bit of content. I will say, for a bit of housekeeping right at the start, that there won't be any breakout rooms today. So for some of you, that might be a bit damn. For some of you, that might be a yes. So, we'll kind of split the difference and not do any. But at the end, there will be something that I'm a kind of a discussion prompt that I'm going to encourage you to take back to your groups and groups that you're part of. And there'll also be time for questions at the end. And I'm hoping this presentation part will last for about an hour, and then we'll have a chance for questions at the end. So I will dive straight in now, and everyone already has their mics muted, I think, so I don't need to do that normal housekeeping stuff, but yeah, just a reminder anyway. So, but first, a story, because who doesn't love a story, especially in a messaging workshop? So as I said at the start, Sound the Alarm, the title of this presentation, has a bit of a personal meaning for me. And that's because it was the name of an action that I was gung-ho about, that I never actually went ahead, but I was completely convinced that it was the best idea in the world. And there was a lot of iterations of this action idea in my head, but the basic premise of it was to go into like a conference which was happening, which was all about farming in the UK, and set off all the fire alarms and have the messaging of sound the alarm, like this is an emergency. Still not entirely convinced it's a bad idea. So if anyone wants to take it and run with it, go for it. I don't know what the charges will be. Not encouraging anyone to do something illegal, of course, any police watching. But I think it really shows how my thinking has evolved over time when it comes to messaging. And I think like this is something I wanted to start off with, because I wanted to show how movements and organizations and groups, they're kind of like sharks. Like they have to keep moving. If they stop, if they stagnate, then that's when they start to die. So when I talk about these new ideas and these different ways of messaging, it's not me saying that there's a right way of thinking and a wrong way of thinking. It's just kind of sharing all these kind of new ideas and thinking that is bubbling up. And I wanted to kind of start off with this because I think it's really important to kind of see how, things change over time and grow over time, and maybe different ideas will come to the forefront, and nothing's really wrong or right. It's more about just taking on new pieces of information and using that to build on what you already have to kind of become more effective, kind of learn from the past, learn from other movements, and grow in our groups and as a movement together. So I think it's also like we have this idea. Our movement, I think a lot of movements, they're built on ideas. And what I like to think messaging as is it's finding different ways of communicating the same idea. So it's finding different ways of getting across to different people, but the idea stays the same. So with that, I'm going to jump in a bit to what I've read being called and what I like to call the narrative cosmos. So this is kind of all these different ways and all these different theories and ways of thinking about how we communicate, messaging, narrative, etc. So this is a quote by a woman named Barbara Hardy, and it goes, "We dream in narrative, daydream in narrative. Remember, anticipate, hope, despair, believe, doubt, plan, revise, criticize, construct, gossip, learn, hate, and love by narrative. In order really to live, we make up stories about ourselves and others, about the personal as well as the social past and future." And I think I studied theatre. That's actually how I got into this all kind of messaging and social change work through studying theatre. Because for me, from a very young age, it was really embedded that narrative stories are what make up our world. And that has just become more and more clear over time, that all these systems that we live in, they're constructed, they're written like a story, they're understood like a story. So when we start to think about the messaging that we used, we can think about it not just as the words that we use, and not just as kind of things like marketing and how different images and words have different associations, and that's really important. We can also think about how the messaging that we use fits into a broader social story. And I think that's really exciting and provides these really big opportunities to see opportunities to change the story, which is, I think, what we're doing when we're trying to make social change. So what is narrative? On the right there is one of my favorite films of all time, Spirit, which I think is the most anti-speciesist film ever made. Don't quote me on that. It's not made to be, but basically it's this film about a horse who is a wild horse in kind of like the so-called Americas, and becomes captured, and then eventually it's a story of this horse whose spirit cannot be broken, I guess, and ends up being free again. And I think it's any film and any like text, anything like that, is a really good way of just articulating and understanding what is narrative, because there is a difference between a narrative and a story, even though they're often used interchangeably. So a narrative is the bigger picture. It's the collection of many stories. It doesn't have a beginning and the end. I think it's a really good way of thinking about it. It's not bounded. It's endless. It's limitless. It's infinite, as I said on the slide. And stories are what make up narratives. So we can create and identify many stories within a narrative. And stories are bounded. They have a beginning, they have a middle, they have an end. So if we think about this film, which some of you may have seen, some of you may have not, the narrative in that is things like freedom, unity with nature, and friendship. So these are infinite concepts which resound throughout time and throughout narratives, throughout like stories, throughout cultures. They don't have a beginning or an end. But the story is the story of this one individual, and their story from being free to being captured to being free again. So if we think about Animal Rebellion, we can think of our narrative as being something like justice, animal and climate justice. That's not something that has an end, that's infinite. Whereas our story might be, a plant-based food system, a just and sustainable plant-based food system. That's something it exists within the narrative, and has an end, it has a beginning, it has a middle. So that kind of helps us with that grounding of what is narrative and what is story. It helps us move on to this, which is, as I said before, this idea of the narrative cosmos. And we're going to talk through this quite quickly. But basically, it's this idea that there's all these different fields of practice that essentially are doing the same thing, which is trying to understand how stories shape our experience of the world. So we have things like narrative strategists, movement building, creatives and cultural organizers. So they're actors, writers, filmmakers, storytelling and sharing. That's a very cultural thing. That's something, oral storytelling traditions, for example. Big data research and analysis, that's, you know, really looking at the metrics of narrative and metrics of messaging. Social and cognitive sciences, so things like linguistics, things like sociology as well kind of falls into that, understanding what shapes the way people are and what shapes the way cultures behave. And then strategic communication. And if anyone was able to come to Jam's session the other week on strategic communication, you'll have learned all about that. And if not, check it out on YouTube. So I think out of all of these, there's a few of them which are really relevant to what we do as Animal Rebellion and as kind of social change movers and shakers in general. I think all of them can be relevant, but I'm going to touch on 4, which I think are particularly relevant. So the number 1 is movement building. So if anyone has kind of done a little bit of reading or thinking about like social change theory, there's this idea of social change which is called structure organizing. And this is that you build organizations and groups who then go out and do things to make change. So these are kind of, you know, charities, NGOs, things like that, community organizing. They all kind of follow this idea of structural organizing. And around these, and yeah, I've kind of stuck to this theme of the narrative cosmos. So I've kind of got this big planet in the center and then these stars floating around. So around these, we have things like public narrative. Public narrative is a way of telling stories, and it's a way of sharing stories. So we have things like story of self, story of like us, and story of now. And this is all about how to teach people and coach people to share their own story. So it's very personal, and it's about sharing, you know, the essence of who you are and why you're taking action. It's a really interesting kind of field of storytelling. Also in the movement building kind of galaxy, we have story-based strategy. And this is the idea that story doesn't just exist in like the messaging sphere. So it's not just what we put out on Facebook or what we write down in an email or on the website. Story exists at the highest level of an organization. It exists when we think about what our next move is, because, and for example, you know, when we think about planning an action or planning a campaign in story-based strategy, rather than the idea coming first and then you make up the messaging, the narrative, the story comes first, and then that influences how you act within that. So first you think about what story you want people to understand, and then you think about how to communicate that. Also in movement building, we have community organizing, which I mentioned. That's your kind of old school, well, new school as well. Phoning people up, gathering momentum, petitions, phone banking parties, all the kind of stuff that's used in like electoral campaigns, door knocking, that's all falls in that. And also disrupting at the point of assumption is a big part of movement building. So trying to get in there before people have the chance to make their assumptions. So, you know, marketing campaigns, trying to change the way people vote, for example, is a great example of movement building. So next up, we have the social and cognitive sciences, which I think is also really relevant. There's amazing linguists, cognitive linguists doing work within the social kind of change sector, an area on all these different ideas. 2 that come to mind are George Lakoff, who does a lot of work on framing, and Nat Shankar and Sario, who does strategic messaging, which is actually in the next slide, but I also very relevant to this because she is a cognitive linguist and brings that a lot into her work. So within social and cognitive sciences, we have things like metaphors. So metaphors are ways of improving our communication, improving how we understand the world, because, you know, sometimes there's these really complex topics and issues that is really hard to communicate by just saying what they are, because, you know, for example, if we take animal farming or speciesism as a kind of a broader concept, like the language and the ideas for people are so far out of their realm of experience that it can be really hard. I'm sure people have had this experience of trying to communicate and just hitting this brick wall of people not understanding because they can't relate it to something in their experience. So what metaphors do is they allow us to give people the opportunity to relate something to another thing that has the same characteristics, but is more related to their experiences. So we also have linguistics within this kind of galaxy. And, we have Joe in the call, who's part of the messaging team as well, and is studying linguistics. And Joe and Adam just did a workshop last week on linguistics. So again, if you missed that one, want to check it out, it's on our YouTube. So linguistics is all about, the language that we use and how that influences how we see the world. We also have things like mental schemas, so the constructs we have in our mind, which affect the way we perceive and understand information, as well as framing. And framing is really connected to mental schemas because basically it's the way we understand and communicate information. So a frame is kind of everything that's included in a message and everything that's left out as well. So we have some really interesting research into framing about how we can more positively utilize framing without, accidentally activating an opponent's frame by using their language, for example. So, making sure we're creating our own frames, our own stories to tell, rather than just spending our whole time refuting or saying why an opponent's frame is wrong. So the next one is strategic messaging. So within this, we have values. So strategic messaging is most often values-based, public-facing messaging, and it usually has an instrumental goal. For example, policy change, electoral victory, shift in thinking or behavior. And most often, it's used in a time-limited and targeted fashion. So you'll see strategic messaging in campaigns a lot, and election kind of campaigns a lot, because it aims to show why people should care. And I think that's like the real heart of strategic messaging. It shows why people should care about a topic that they might not think they should care about. So for example, why people should care about who they vote for, why people should care about a specific bill that's going through Parliament. So that's why it's really rooted in values and trying to identify what values are going to most appeal to a target audience and using those values in their messaging. It's used a lot in campaigns. It's very heavily rooted in audience research. So you'll see a lot of focus groups, interviews used in strategic messaging, and it has an instrumental goal most often. And it can be used for other things as well, for like more kind of broader abstract concepts, but I think this is the context that it really shines in, of these really short-term instrumental goals in campaigns. And the final one is narrative strategy, and this kind of sits by itself because it's more of a newer area of research and understanding. And basically it's narrative strategists bring multiple disciplines to bear and bridge many of the sectors which have been previously identified. And this is the idea, once again, that narrative sits at kind of the top. It shapes how we organize, how we plan, how we decide what to focus on and what not. And it's designed to, over time, create profound shifts in the narrative, values, beliefs, and behaviors of people. So this is the kind of narrative that, rather than being short-term and specific outcome focused, it's more very long-term, with this idea of identifying, what in society is propping up these stories that are propping up these behaviors and these systems, and how can we change that over time and bring about a new story. So it's very kind of long-term focused. So that's kind of the narrative cosmos, as I said, very brief tour through it. And the reason I started with that is because I think it's important to understand all these different ideas and ways of thinking about messaging, and how they might come to play in different elements. So for example, we might be working on a campaign and we might decide we really need to focus on strategic messaging. So we need to think, what is our end goal? Who is our audience? And how are we going to go about it? But at another time, we might be working on movement building and we want to be mobilizing people and bringing people in. So we might be thinking about how can we encourage and empower people to tell their story? What does that look like? Does that look like talking on the phone, talking to people face to face? Outreach is a great example. And other times we might be thinking about, how do we make sure a spokesperson or someone doing an interview is ready to talk about our message without getting distracted by other people's messaging and getting off topic. So that's a very brief tour through, as I said, the narrative cosmos, and how all of these ideas kind of come together to allow us to communicate in a really kind of effective way and challenge stories on a really high level, as well as creating new stories at all levels of the organization, from, when we're talking, when we're writing, when we're creating content, et cetera, and through actions as well. So next off, I'm going to jump into hope-based communication. And this is something, as I said, that has really inspired me through the work that I've been doing. And it's something that I stumbled upon quite recently, but got me really excited through the potential that I see that it has for the way we communicate, and for how we share messages and get people on board. And I like hope-based communication because I think it straddles these three different areas of messaging in a really interesting way. So it straddles this idea of movement building because it's all about showing support for heroes. And what I mean by heroes, as I'll touch on in a sec, is showing support for people who are on the kind of front lines. The most affected people, instead of being victims, are really heroes. And encouraging people and giving people the tools to share their stories. It also straddles this strategic messaging. It can be used to develop really targeted values-based messaging. And it also touches on this social and cognitive science. This hope-based communication, as I'll go into a sec, is really rooted in research on human behavior and cognition. So I'm going to jump into it now and give a little bit of an introduction to this idea of hope-based communication. So there's two quotes here, which I think that they actually come from two different places, but I think together they give the real root of hope-based communication. So if you want to take a sec to read it, I'll also read it out if people aren't able to kind of look at the screen for whatever reason. So hope-based communication is a simple methodology that proactively and explicitly promotes the values and solutions we want to see in society. It focuses on creating a climate of togetherness and empathy to avoid being sidetracked by responses to populist frames and narratives. By grounding your communication from the values you stand for and a vision of the world you want to see, hope-based communication is an antidote to debates that seem constantly framed to favor your opponents, so that you can design actions that set the agenda rather than constantly reacting to external events. So essentially, hope-based communication, it's a way of taking the high ground. So rather, when we're messaging in fear, we're often reacting to situations. We're often reacting to things that the people we're trying to get people to see how horrible they are. And by people, I mean corporations, of course, not individuals. But when we're messaging in a way that's targeting fear, we're often feeding into those ideas and those value sets. So, for example, one thing that the current system loves is this narrative of scarcity, that there's not enough, that everyone needs to, take care of themselves because there's not enough to be caring for everyone in society, and that we all need to, work beyond our means because otherwise we'll be, fall into this horrible situation and there's not enough to kind of care for everyone. And when we kind of use that kind of messaging of this idea of fear and scarcity, we actually feed into that narrative that people should only care about themselves rather than allowing people to open up their circle of compassion. So often when we're trying to emphasize the urgency of a situation, we inadvertently end up supporting the aims of our opponents. So the thing is, our system is built on a myth of scarcity, and this pushes people to be increasingly insular and self-involved and fearful of anything new or different. And when we try and do the opposite, when we try and activate this idea of hope and kind of possibility, it puts people in an open state where they're far more likely to be able to connect to universal values and think collectively rather than individually. So I guess the question that comes up when we talk about hope-based communication is, yeah, that sounds great, but how do we do it? And what the idea is it gives us these 5 shifts, which allow us to think about our current messaging and how we can change it to be more rooted in hope. And I'm going to go through these quite quickly. But basically, shift 1 is to talk solutions. So this is to give people something to say yes to. So much of the time we're saying what we don't want, and this is fine because it's important to show what the problem is. But we want people to walk away knowing what to say yes to, rather than just feeling like there's so many things to say no to and it's overwhelming. So one thing I like, one kind of like golden rule, is like 1 part problem, 2 part solutions in everything that you say. In all your messaging, it's 1 part problem, 2 part solutions. And when I say solutions, I mean possibilities, of course. Shift 2 is what we stand for. So this is all about connecting to global values. And if you're not sure what like global values are, there's a lot of resources online if you just Google like what are kind of common values. But I think everyone in a way like has been exposed to kind of global values their whole life. So if you think about at school, at your workplace, at anywhere you've kind of, at your university, if you went to university, and anywhere you've kind of been, there's usually kind of these common values that are repeated as being things most people believe in. These might be things like justice, freedom, respect, fairness. So these are kind of like these global values. And I think, when we think about it, there are some things that we know to be quite universal values that people don't really argue against. And when we communicate using global values, we're connecting people to this kind of bigger picture. So shift 3 is creating opportunities. This is the idea of giving opportunity and dropping threats. So rather than being like, if you don't do this, this horrible thing is going to happen, shifting to, if you do this, this amazing thing could happen. And this ties into this idea that we want to be known as builders, not fighters. We want to be seen as building a better world rather than just fighting, because fighting brings people to the streets for a flash, but people can't fight forever. But people want to build forever. Shift 4 is support for heroes rather than pity for victims. And this is really rooted in rehumanizing. So it's showing people who are most effective, not as victims who need pity, because again, like pity exhausts people. People get compassion fatigue. People can't care over and over again as much as we wish they could. But when it's about support and solidarity, people really shift in and they're just like, yeah, that's awesome. Like we've all seen when someone does something amazing and it's really lifted up, people kind of rallying behind that and being like, how great is that? And the final one is showing that we got this. So we want to be associated with victory. And I've said this a million times. You'll probably hear me saying it a million times again, is that no one wants to be on a train heading in the wrong direction. So celebrating our wins and redefining what a win is. A win isn't just changing the entire system. Like if we set that as the only way we could win, we're going to be constantly feeling like we're failing. Wins are mobilizing people. Wins are every new volunteer who comes and joins this organization. A win is the demonstration that happened today in Sweden. Like these are all wins. And when we're showing that we got this, people are going to jump on board and want to be associated with a group that's winning and moving forward. So what's the big deal about hope-based communication? It lets us control the message. It gives us the power to create new ways of talking and thinking about a topic. It allows us the freedom to build rather than just destroy. I feel like we spend a lot of time trying to show why what's currently happening is bad. And this allows us the opportunity to move beyond that to showing what else could be, what is possible. And I think Anna Morabayan has done this really well, with Smithfield, all these examples of showing the possibilities. It opens hearts and minds. People are more open when they're thinking about global values, and people are more willing to take action for something that feels so big and doesn't just make them want to hide away in their house and take care of themselves. And it challenges us as a movement, as a group, as an organization to think about what we want, what we stand for. And I think that's really important to keep challenging us. And it denies the validity of our opponent's frames by not engaging with them, by choosing not to engage, and by building new frames instead. And it feels good. Talking this way, communicating this way, creating actions this way feels good. It feels like we're building and not just constantly fighting. So I put a couple of examples here. I'll just go through them really quickly. And these are movements around the world who have used really effectively hope-based communication, even if they didn't exactly kind of know, well, maybe they did, but maybe they didn't name it exactly as that. So one of them is in Argentina, what was known as the Green Tide. So this was resounding support for a bill, I'm pretty sure, which would legalize abortion. And people really got behind this. And one of the main big things that really made it boom was this sense of belonging. So if you see in that picture, like everyone has the star and everyone has the green flag, and this became fashionable, these green like neckties and this like green symbols. And it became cool to be part of it because people were excited about what they were building together. People felt this sense of belonging and hope about building this better world. Another really fantastic example is the marriage equality movement. And there's an article which I'll share in the follow-up email, which basically walks through how the marriage equality movement really used these concepts of strategic messaging to move from this idea of equal rights and stuff like that to this idea of yes to equality, yes to love. And it's a great example of how they gave people something to say yes to. And again, like neither of these movements like completely won. Like, in Argentina, I'm sure it's not like the end of feminist struggles, and the rights for LGBTQ people was not finished with the marriage equality movement. But they're really great examples of how people use this kind of messaging to show support for heroes and build this sense of solidarity and give people something to say yes to as well. So let's see some proof. So this is the section where I'm going to go through some recent research which has been done, which really I think shows some really useful things that I think we can really take on board. So this is a group, a project called Framing Climate Justice in the UK. And as it says there, it's a 12-month project which brought together organizers from across the climate movement to tell the stories that matter and strengthen our movement in the fight for justice. So this was essentially a project that was born out of the realization that the climate movement had become quite successful at talking about climate change, but that this deeper message of climate justice, which included things like capitalism and colonialism, was missing. And there was a curiosity and a desire to know how we can change that, how we can make those connections. So I'm going to go through quite quickly some of the findings from this project, and I'm going to send out the website and all these slides after the presentation, so feel free to go in more detail in your own time. And you'll also notice in a sec that the color scheme and the style of my slides changed, or you might not, but that's because I'm using the slides from Framing Climate Justice. So these are the actual slides from the organization sharing their findings, which I thought could be useful. So the project itself was 26 participants, 12 months, 7 staff, 5 sessions, 3 research phases, and 1 community. Oh, very sweet. And what they did was they started off by looking at the current research on climate communication and finding that there wasn't much in the area they were looking at. So the aim of the project was to strengthen the climate justice movement, understand how the UK public thinks or doesn't think about climate change, improve climate justice communications, and that's it. So that wasn't a negative thing, sorry, I just didn't realize that was it. So they started off by thinking about the story of the climate justice movement. And they came up with all these ideas of what climate justice is for the climate justice movement. These ideas that change is possible, climate change is real, there's these exploitative systems, our sphere of concern is global, we need to redistribute resources and decentralize power. And then they decided they wanted to see how this connected with what the general public think. Where were the areas of commonality and where were the fault lines? And what they found, I think, was really interesting. So they found a lot of common ground. They found that people know that climate change is happening here and now and that it's quite bad. So that the messaging on that front has really worked, and that we don't need to invest as much time in that anymore, convincing people that it's real and that it's bad. You know, we still have climate deniers around there, but the vast majority of people know that it's happening, know that it's bad, and don't really need to be told that anymore. And that gives us the opportunity to go deeper and connect on a different level. People do think that government and corporates are responsible, not individuals. People think that the status quo isn't working, that some industries are damaging, which I think is a really big understanding, that people don't think the status quo is working. This communication that we've been trying to get across for so long, that the system isn't working, people agree with that and they believe that. So that raises the question, okay, what's next? How can we show them how it's not working and how we can change it? People think that big changes are needed and that everyone should have a bigger role, including frontline and Indigenous communities. And this is an important new insight from the group, which is that people tend to agree that the least responsible suffer most. And younger people tend to agree that climate change multiplies existing injustices, but older people don't, which is really interesting. And then we came across then this group kind of came across the fault lines. So what is different about the way the climate movement and the public conceive or think about this topic? So we saw that people, like the general public, don't believe that colonialism and capitalism and that this system is operating by design. You know, they think it's an accident, that climate change, that climate crisis is happening. There's this idea of there's a difference between who is responsible, whether it's like the elites, profiteers, or specific countries, or just humans in general, that human nature is just bad. People think that, you know, they're not sure if climate relates to oppression. The general public think that human nature is fixed and greedy, whereas the movement believes that we are changeable and capable, and we can fix this and we can address this. I think that's a really interesting point. The general public want to focus locally, and they think that the leadership should come from the global north rather than frontline communities. The solutions from the general public tend to be more towards new technology and new laws rather than system change. And I think a really key thing, which I kind of touched on before, is that, you know, our vision of a better world, or our vision of the world, is one of abundance, where the distribution is the problem, whereas the general public see the world, the vision of their world, is one of scarcity. So it's not that, you know, some people get too much and other people don't get enough. It's that there's not enough to go around. So, and the general public have a lot of distrust and fatalism about the future, mixed in with some hope, which is what we kind of want to build on. So recommendations from that is that we explain how climate change multiplies oppression. We address people's distrust of the government when appealing to the government's responsibility. And I'm going to touch on that towards the end, because I think that's really quite relevant for Animal Rebellion, being an organization that focuses on us of the government. How does that kind of fly when we know that people are very distrustful of the government? I think that's a really important conversation. Introducing economic design into the frame using relatable examples, connecting the dots between colonialism and capitalism using economic design. Ideas like using metaphors like a blueprint, a rigged game, things like that, or a shared meal where some people have enough and other people don't. Also things like naming countries and communities rather than using kind of vague terms like the global south, and acknowledging the problems we have in the UK when advocating global solidarity. And I think, yeah, the last point is something that really rings true with what we've been talking about hope-based communication, leveraging the hope people do have. So the next piece of the research that was done was all about framing. And this is, as I said earlier, what and how should we communicate? And this is where we really touch on some of the things that I mentioned right at the start about this idea of emergency messaging. How do we talk to people? So recommendations that came out of this frame testing that they did was that people want to see solidarity with those most affected, and being careful about relying on emergency framing. And I'm going to go through all of these in a little bit more detail in a sec. Appealing to self-direction as well was a big recommendation. And I think this is really important for us as a movement because of the way that we organize, trying to be decentralized, and using that and appealing to that, this idea of self-direction and autonomy and choice. And I think as well, using metaphors to introduce concept, and it doesn't have to be economic design. That was the example used in this, but I think using metaphors and developing metaphors to explain complex issues is a really positive recommendation for us moving forward. So I'm going to touch on these quite slightly. So solidarity with those most affected. I think this is something really important for Animal Rebellion as we move forward and want to be part of this global justice movement and want to allow the general public to connect to how these issues are all connected. And this is ticks kind of all the boxes for people seeing that those least responsible are the most affected, which I kind of think extends to animals as well. It's also people agreeing that people affected should be playing a bigger role in developing solutions. So rather than just, governments and scientists deciding on solutions, everyone affected playing this big role. And it's also the top result for people having hope for solutions. So this idea of solidarity and standing with people who are affected and who are fighting and building this new system. So the number 2 is be careful with emergency frames. This is a really interesting one because while it allows us to point the finger at big global actors rather than taking it away from individual change, and it also allows people to feel that marginalized communities, Indigenous communities should have a bigger role in decision making. What it really does is make people think like a top-down response is the best result for, just scientists and experts are the ones who decide what changes, technological solutions, because this idea of urgency is that we need to fix it fast. So, and what we know about trying to fix things fast is that often people who are already in marginalized situations or who are already the most affected, they're the first to go, they're the first to be kind of cut off the list of who gets help. And it also made people more likely to say that climate change has no impact on existing injustices, which I think is really interesting. And it's highlighted there because they pointed out in the session that they didn't really know why this was the case. They didn't really understand the correlation, but there was definitely a strong causation between people not connecting the climate crisis to other injustices when using emergency messaging. And it could be that it's because it makes it more insular, it makes it scary for you. So people lose that ability to be open to other issues and other people and other individuals, which is kind of what we talked about in hope-based communication, allowing people to open up. So what should we do? Appealing to self-direction when talking about affected groups was a really big recommendation that came out. People were more likely, when doing this, people were more likely to say that climate change impacts the most marginalized. People were more likely to blame wealthy governments rather than blaming, countries who are, often the most affected, such as India and China. People showed more support for a bigger role of governments of poorer countries in solutions. And the final recommendation is introducing economic design with metaphors. So some of the metaphors that were used as examples were something like a rigged game. So for example, showing that this is a system that is acting exactly the way it should. And I think that's something that has really spoken to me in hope-based communication and in all of this research, is helping people, communicating this idea that this isn't a broken system. This system is acting exactly the way it should. it's always been designed to have people who are negatively affected by it. It's always been designed to be an extractive kind of system, so that we need a new system, because it's not that this one's broken and that we can just fix it. We need a new system entirely. And when we're talking about something like a just and sustainable plant-based food system, that's not an adjustment of the current system. That's a new system. So I think it's really important to bring in these metaphors to explain these big concepts. Another one that was used, as well as like a rigged game, was a shared meal. So that it's a shared meal where some people get really good food and some people get really bad food. And this is just a quick summary of the findings of the framing climate justice, sorry. So my final little piece is, what does this mean for us as Animal Rebellion? And this is quite a brief presentation, so I'm not going to be able to get into too much, but there's a couple of points that I wanted to make before I wrapped up about what I think the potential I see this having for us as an organization, the way we communicate. So one is this idea of emphasizing hope over fear. I think as an organization, as a movement, our whole premise is based on this idea of opening up your circle of compassion, opening up your mind to new possibilities, because we're really trying to go against the status quo, going against what is current, while also, being very rooted in science, very rooted in what the science is telling us. So by emphasizing hope over fear, we give people the chance to say yes to something, to say yes to a future that they want to say yes to, rather than telling them why they should be terrified, and kind of forcing them to retreat into this shell of, I just need to take care of myself. I just need to take care of my family. I don't want to think about other people. It's too much. It's too overwhelming. Another thing that it means for us, I think, is this idea of being careful when making demands to the government. And this doesn't mean not making demands of the government. I think, that's a really important kind of message and tactic and strategy. But acknowledging when we do that there's an enormous mistrust of the government in the general public. It's not just us in the social change kind of world who think the government isn't doing a very good job. It's ordinary people who don't trust the government, don't think they're doing a very good job, don't trust them to care about them or what's happening in the world. So acknowledging that when we're talking about the government, acknowledging that they need to do a heck of a lot better and that we don't trust them, but they could be better. Another one is acknowledging our successes. So moving forward, allowing us to see what has worked and how we can build on that. And also, back to hope-based communication, the shifts, like showing that we got this, showing that we do know what we're doing, showing that people can get on board and be part of a team that's moving and progressing, and celebrating wins. And again, as I said earlier, redefining what wins means to us as a group, as a team. Another one is standing with, not for. And this is the whole idea of solidarity. And when we're connecting ourselves to other movements, rather than kind of trying to take that and be like, look, our things that are going on are really bad because it's also happening to these people, trying to bring in this idea of solidarity, and that we're all part of this same movement pushing for justice and building a more just world, and building those collaborations and connections. And I think this is something people can do in their local areas as well, connecting with other groups, connecting with local people, and building these coalitions with other groups and organizations. I think show, don't tell as well, explaining connections and showing a vision of the future. So rather than just telling people everything that's wrong with the present, showing people how the world could be better. Because I think, when we show a vision of a different world, people are so much more likely to say, I want to be part of that, rather than if we just tell them like everything that's wrong and then kind of at the end tack on, you should support this, because people don't want to just see everything that's wrong in the world. They're already in that. People want to see how the world could be better, and we have the opportunity to show that through our messaging, through our imagery, through our actions. And the final point I'm going to make is offering, not arguing. So as an organization, as a movement, we have a lot to offer. We have a lot to give people. We're really trying to, offer people the chance of a future. Like, that's kind of the whole basis of our movement, that we're offering people a future. So that's a lot to offer. So when we kind of come up against people, whether it's face to face, whether it's online, who don't agree with us, we don't really need to argue. We don't need to stand and fight with people who aren't currently at the point where they want to jump on board. We offer, and then we know that people will take up that offer. And we mobilize, and we use messaging that aims to activate our base, persuade our middle, and alienate our opposition. So I think a really good rule of thumb is that if the people you're standing against agree with your messaging, then you probably should revise your messaging, because we're not trying to make everyone like us. We are being challenging. We are going up against the status quo. So we want to be doing messaging that almost everyone thinks is like, that's fair, that's reasonable, that connects to values that I actually hold, except for our opposition, who are standing on the other side of the line being like, no, that's horrible, because it goes against, all of our values of making more and more money. So I think what I like to think of is, when we're thinking about persuading our middle, we're really showing people that they actually agree with us, even if they don't think they do. And I think that can be that big moment, and it often comes when you appeal to these global values. And people might have had this experience of communicating an idea, and someone being a bit surprised that they actually agree with you, because they realize that what you're saying actually connects to the deeper values that they hold. So that brings me to the end of my little talk. So my final thing is to encourage everyone to give it a go. And this is in your groups, by yourself, in any kind of organizations or team that you're part of. Take some messaging that you've used before, and have a go at trying to reframe it, reshape it using hope-based communication. Have a go at applying this when writing posts, for example. Go back through this PowerPoint if you are so inclined, and see things that you can take away and use. And I think this applies to every training that we do at Animal Rebellion. It's always designed to be of practical use. So really I really encourage people to go away and try this out and see if it works, and see any new insights that you have that then you can share back, and let's build on these ideas together. And I'm going to finish up with a final quote before we go to questions, which is that narratives are powerful. They can swing juries and elections, they can fill prisons, but they can also fill the streets. So yeah, thank you so much everyone for coming, and I'm going to open up to questions in a sec. And I just want to say that, if you're here, you might be thinking, this is great, but I don't really know how I can use this. But if you're here, you're a leader within Animal Rebellion. Anyone can be a leader within Animal Rebellion. We all have the potential to be movement leaders in ourselves. And if you're here, if you're showing up, you are a leader, and you can take these ideas and you can bring them to new spaces, and you can be innovative and create and change. And yeah, just thank you so much for coming along tonight. And I will stop sharing my screen so I can see everyone again. Hello. And open up to questions.
Harley, it's Philip. Thank you so much. That was a really great presentation. Very skillful.